Good evening, everyone. Both Kanika and I have represented Delhi University in international debates a few years apart. The good thing about debating um, when your time is past is when you then control the bell and you leave the responsibility to others. We're delighted that you're joining us this evening. It's the second edition of the Renewable Energy Dialogue, which we hope will become an annual feature and a growing feature to focus not just on renewable energies but on energy transitions in a uniquely different story that is playing out in a country like India, very different in its energy transitions compared to other countries. Kanika, as she was leaving the stage, kind of provoked us, rightly so, that there aren't enough, or rather there aren't any women on this panel here, in these debating teams. And we hope that by the third, fourth, fifth, sixth edition of the Renewable Energy Dialogue, it's not just a question of women on the panel, but we'll have women in leadership positions of renewable energy companies so that they are able to speak their mind from that position of leadership. That said, there is a lot of firepower on the stage today. We are not going to be formally introducing the bios of all the four speakers, but the contrast is very palpable. CEEW's team has an average age of about 29.7, but between the four speakers here, or debaters here, there's a combined cumulative work experience of nearly, or if not more, than 100 years. So somewhere between their experience and our youthfulness and our innocence and our wide-eyed exuberance, we hope we'll find some sort of, some semblance of understanding where the market is heading. Today's debate has a very simple proposition, which will hopefully have very complicated answers. The proposition is, this House believes that India's energy transition is inevitable. This House believes that India's energy transition is inevitable. What is an energy transition? It could mean a transition from dirty to clean energy, and that is how energy transitions have been sort of interpreted, at least in the West. But in India, an energy transition is also about from not having modern energy to having access to modern sources of energy. It could also mean a shift from patterns of energy demand concentrated in our rural areas, because that's where the bulk of the population lives, to patterns of energy demand which would be shaped by our urbanization revolution. It could also mean a shift from relative autarky of the Indian energy system vis-a-vis the rest of the global energy market to much greater and deeper integration into global energy markets, which will impact our energy security and which will impact the energy dynamics in the market. But it's also important to understand, when we think about energy transitions, is before we look out to the future, we have to look back. How far have we come? And Dr. Frankl and I were on a Twitter chat that Hero Future Energies had organized a few hours earlier, and we were discussing on that, that it's exactly 10 years since India's National Action Plan on Climate Change was announced in 2008. And if we were to sort of rewind back to 2008, or if today were the day we were announcing a National Action Plan on Climate Change, would we have at all imagined then that we would have crossed 60,000 megawatts of renewable energy capacity installed, particularly more than 20,000 megawatts of solar installed? So if you have to predict the future, is looking at the back sufficient? So how far have we come? But also, are we moving fast enough? Is a 1,000-fold increase in our capacity in terms of renewables in the last few years really a signal of the pace at which that energy transition has to happen? Another big question that comes to my mind is, what are the major disruptions? What are we not factoring in? 2 weeks ago, I was lecturing in San Francisco on automation, artificial intelligence, and the future of energy and investment. I know very little about automation. I know very little about artificial intelligence, and I don't control much in terms of energy investment. But when I connect those dots, I realize that there's stuff happening on the technology side, on the way finance is flowing, that is going to likely impact and disrupt energy markets that we are perhaps factoring in, perhaps not, and you'll hear from the experts. And finally, the big question for me is not about congratulating ourselves of how far we've gotten, but how do we understand our failures so that we do things differently? The only way to predict the future is to shape it. So while we think about the future, while we do forecasts, while we think about scenarios, what is it within our control that we would do differently, either as business persons and investors, as analysts, as policymakers, to drive this energy transition? So that's enough from me. As I said, I have very little role to play apart from ringing the bell. The format of the debate is to be deliberately schizophrenic. So these are not actually two teams. There are four individuals who have been, we've cheated a little bit in parliamentary debate. Actually, you're supposed to be giving the motion only 5 minutes in advance. We've given it to them about 5 days in advance. But one day for you, Paolo. But the idea is that each speaker will have a chance to speak for the motion for exactly 3 minutes. The counter will come on your screens, so you will know. Once it's up, I get the pleasure of doing this. And then once the speakers are finished, they switch their minds and start speaking against the motion. And then we'll have a bit of a tete-a-tete between them, and then we'll also open up to the audience and go forward from there. We want to keep it tight. We want to keep it focused, because the motion is very clear. This House believes that India's energy transition is inevitable. I'm going to start with Mr. Sunil Jain, CEO of Hero Future Energies, and I am supposed to actually indicate to the AV team there that the time starts now.
Good evening. You can start my time a little later, because I must compliment Ghosh for doing all this, but at the same time, he showed that he's the youngest of the members on the stage. And there'll be a transition on the gender bias. Don't worry, Kanika. So my time starts now. So, the Indian energy sector transition took place when we had COP21. I think so that was the day when we signed, and that was the day when transition already started. And keeping in mind that India had always talked about the energy security and lack of energy or electricity in the sector, we knew that the only answer was that we move from the normal conventional power to a renewable power and to a distributed power. What is now proving out to be the right thing is that India is now going to move from electricity to electrification. And what I mean is, those high announcements about the electrification of villages will not matter anymore. It's the flow of electrons which is going to matter in the homes. And that probably will happen more through a distributed power, which means renewable power. I believe that is the future, what it is going to happen. And this transition looks difficult to be stopped. More so because our cost of renewable power has fallen so low that it's very difficult for the conventional power to compete with it. Now, once that is there, I believe it makes economic sense for anybody to buy that power and rely on that power. So that is one thing what I believe is a transition which is going to happen. It's very difficult to stop. There's one more transition in energy which is going to happen globally. It is going to be the transition from electrons to megabytes. I don't believe it is the electrons who will rule in the future, but it will be the megabytes, and it is your mobile phone, which is the technology which is going to rule the future of electricity in the world. You will be having iCloud systems all over the world from where you could draw your electricity. And that is possible only through all the sources of energy, but more so through storage and renewables combined, because they will remain as the cheapest source of power. So that is another transition which is inevitable, nobody can stop it. There's another transition which is going to happen is, and which of course will be based on the technology, is the blockchain. Blockchains are going to revolutionize how we are going to set up the projects and finance the projects, and how the cost of energy will be brought down when we remove the middlemen from the entire value chain of how the energy is delivered. Now these factors, once they are involved, the transition is going to be complete in favor of the renewable energy. Of course, renewable energy has its own challenges which we'll debate later on, but I believe the next 10 years is a place where renewable will play the bigger role compared to your conventional energy. Another point which we must make is that there will be competition, as the thermal energy is going to come on your back very harshly. So beware and move on. Thank you.
Fantastic. Those were 4 very tight points. The bar has been set. And I'm going to swing across to the other side of the stage and ask Dr. Paolo Frankl, head of the Renewable Energy Division at IEA, to best Mr. Jain.
Okay, I'll try my best. Now, let me tell you 3 reasons why I think the transition is inevitable here. First is technology, progressing so fast that nobody of us would predict. You said 2008, this was another era. Solar was 10 times at least more expensive than that. Nobody would predict generation cost around 2 cents or 3 cents around the world. We forecast 1,000 gigawatts of renewables coming online in the next 5 years. This is half of the capacity of the whole coal that required 80 years to be built. That's the pace of change. And this is just the first part. A new generation of technologies will come, storage, other renewables, digitalization. All this is technology driven, very fast, much faster than we would predict. The second thing is the very fast development of your society. You spoke about the energy transition in India. I'm speaking about a sustainable mix which responds to energy access, energy security, and climate change and air pollution at the right time. This is a must for your society, and renewables for the energy access are the fastest way to do it, and they are becoming affordable for the part, or to reach the poorest. And then you have another trend, which is to ensure the fast economic development. You have a rising middle class. Quality of development becomes as important as the quantity of development, which means clean air, good cities, and good quality of life. And these will be the drivers for the energy transition, because your society will be demanding for these things. And the third keyword why I think the transition now is inevitable is leadership of your country. We said before, the country is becoming a world player in renewables at the same level for the next growth of Europe, United States. And this is part number 1. You have ambitious renewable targets that are supported by policies, but the other aspect which is really important, which I agree, the future will be running very much on software and not just on hardware. And you are a leader in the world for software and a leader in organizing it. Think, for instance, the interface between solar rooftops, your electric vehicle, the battery of the electric vehicle giving flexibility and ancillary services to the system. All this will require very sophisticated and top state-of-the-art software, and India will be a leader in the world in providing this, not just for your country, but actually leading the transition in the whole world. This is why I think the transition is inevitable. No doubts.
Vineet Mittal is a serial entrepreneur and has the distinction of having put in place the largest capacity of renewables. Now he's leading AVAADA Power. Vineet, is the transition inevitable?
Uh, I'm going to talk slightly differently. I think transition is inevitable, uh, and the factors shared by my colleagues are all correct, but because the public is going to demand for it. So I started believing in it more, even not after being in the business. The day Times of India and Economic Times started writing about the impact of pollution on the front page. When I started hearing in the dinner talks in Bombay and Delhi that how do you cope up going to Delhi and still remain fit? And thirdly, like when people started asking, do I take my sons when I go to Delhi or not? So I think these conversations at home, in social circle, in the front of social media is going to drive the change. And those changes will be in the positive direction and will probably speed up the transition in much speedier fashion than it's happening. And the second reason I believe the change is going to happen is the day people realize that we give $150 million subsidy to every 1,000 megawatt of thermal power plant every day. So I'm going to prove my point. So coal in India is given through coal linkages for thermal power plant at 1,000 rupees of 5,300 AR basis. And same coal is sold, today's price was $2,900 in e-auction. So $1,900 difference. And Indian coal, 5 million ton coal is used for every gigawatt of power generated. So Indian coal is 6 also and 5.5 depending on the mine. But let's look at the everywhere's thumb rule of 5 million. So 5 million and 1900. So you are looking at more than 150 billion even in today's exchange rate. So the day people realize that our government talks about sustainability but gives more than $15 billion subsidy every year to the coal and has difficulty to even give $1 billion to the solar, which is life-saving, and storage, which is going to disrupt the sector, I think change is going to speed up. Probably we won't see any new thermal capacity coming up. And even in a phased manner, reduction in the depreciated power plant, because it just makes good sense to do solar business or wind business. And battery is going to be so cheap that people are bound to ask the government that if I can see this, even not being in business and just as a common citizen, why our government who cares so much about us is not making that change. And change is going to happen speedier than ever before. Thank you.
Thank you, Vineet. Nitin Prasad is chairman of Shell India. Nitin, Shell is an oil and gas company or a gas and oil company, but the point is renewables can't so easily replace, fuel for transport. But you are being forced to speak in favor of the motion. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Arunabha. So for a little bit more of the vertically challenged, I'm going to stand up and actually speak my words. Yeah, I think the challenges of being last is that all the good points have been made. So let me just try and talk a little bit about this. I think what I'd like to suggest to you is this even the first energy transition that we faced in our lives? Or, sorry, in our lives, but as a human population. And the answer, of course, is no. Right? 150 years ago, lighting, all of this was in candles, and then we talked about kerosene, and then we started talking about, not even electricity. We started taking a look at other alternatives. We look at mobility at some point in time. There was a point in time with the original version of the cars in the 1920s when the vehicle fleet was 60% electric. And then we switched to fossil fuels, and now we're switching back. So energy transition, to my mind, is a constant. It's not a new challenge for the decade. It's a challenge every decade going forward. So what makes this energy transition, or what grounds most energy transitions in going forward? In my mind, it's largely about affordability and accessibility. The form that the energy takes needs to be, in some sense, accessible, to the individuals and the population, but it also needs to be affordable. It needs to be at a price point. And as you see the transitions that have been done over the past decades, this is what has always grounded the way forward. If you then unpack that and suggest what drives accessibility and affordability, well then let's take a look at three different things. And it's a summary largely of the points that have been made. One is technology. Second is innovation, sometimes in business models and approaches. And the third is consumer preferences. And so as you take a look at that, we've spoken quite a bit about technology, and we've seen the rate of change in the prices of panels. At one point in time, Shell used to supply 15% of the world's global solar panels, and it was incredibly expensive, and so we sold that entire business. Perhaps still the right decision, by the way, but it tells you that at that point in time, even we did not predict, being the largest manufacturer of panels, the rate of change that technology was going to take us down in terms of the price points that's available. Innovation in business models. In the UK, we're seeing for separation of carriage and carrier for content and carriage for power systems, and all of a sudden you can now imagine virtually based digital business models being created where there's companies providing electricity. So we just recently acquired a company called First Utility that provides consumers across the UK with no infrastructure whatsoever. And consumer preferences. We will not continue to live in the most polluted city in the world, and we will not tolerate it. There will be a change along the way. So I think energy transition is grounded on these three pillars and will be inevitable.
Thank you. In a span of 12 minutes and 3 seconds, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 reasons why the energy transition is inevitable. I wish our parliament would act this efficiently. But just to pick up on Nitin's point about this not being the first energy transition, in the 1860s, Vanity Fair magazine published a cartoon, which I wish I could show it to you here. It's on my computer, of a bunch of whales having a ball. Why? Because until then, the lighting was fueled by whale blubber. And that was the time when oil was found in Pennsylvania. So the whales were saved, and something else began to light up our lives. Okay, so you've heard 15 reasons why the energy transition is inevitable. Now we're going to go back in the order we started. We're going to ask you to turn against yourselves. Mr. Jain, why is the energy transition not inevitable?
Well, as we always say, technology is making big inroads. And there is a possibility that other forms of energy could make big inroads. Even the existing technologies of thermal and oil and gas, they come out with new business models and new technology and new innovations, which could make less pollution in the environment and therefore give a very competing reply to the transition to energy. That's one part. Secondly, I believe while we are talking of large-scale deployment of renewables, we haven't talked about a circular economy which is going to be impacted very badly by the large-scale deployment of turbines all over the world, solar panels all over the world. We believe that, okay, we have got another planet to live in, and this is not the only planet. Can you even believe that the kind of energy which would be required to deploy, my friend told me, 1,000 gigawatts in next 5 years? Even if the efficiency goes up, and let me assume that half the area is required, but still the number of panels is mind-boggling. It could run into 1,000 million panels on the surface of the earth. Now, do we have an idea what will we do at the end of the life of these projects? How are we going to dispose them? Is it the thing? Because a 4 gigawatt thermal project versus 4 gigawatt of solar panel project, it's a whole lot of difference. Secondly, you are putting up turbines in the offshore all over the place. How do you recycle them at the end of the life? We are not thinking about that. The battery systems which are going to come in, how are we going to recycle those batteries? Will the cost of transporting those rejected materials and end of the life products to their recycled plants, are we talking about those costs? We don't know. And I have done some back of the envelope calculation, and I believe that you could be ending using 1 million trucks in 2050 to transport these products to the recycled plants all over the world. And those all vehicles, I assume, will be powered by batteries. And if that is the case, the number of batteries to be recycled is going to be a big question. So I don't know whether things will be the same way what we are thinking about a low carbon economy. Thank you.
Thank you. We as a species, we always solve the problems of the past without thinking through the problems of the future in our solutions. So thanks for raising those points. Dr. Frankl, the IEA, not necessarily you, has traditionally been more conservative about renewables in its sort of scenarios and forecasts. For good reasons. So tell us those reasons.
So, I spoke about 3 reasons for heaven, now 3 reasons for hell. First, with technology progress of PV and wind, the problem is not the cost, the problem is system integration. Do we have enough flexibility here in terms of grids, in terms of storage, in terms of dispatchable supply, in terms of demand-side response? And my response, my simplified response, not so easily. Grids, yes, you have an interconnected system, but weak interconnections. Dispatchable supply, gas is difficult in this country, so if you have an energy security problem, you will end up still using coal. Storage, yes, very nice, electric vehicles and batteries. We just heard about the end of life of batteries, so this will be an expensive way and is not so easy to implement it. And demand-side response, yes, but do we have the right market design? And the very simple answer is no, we don't have the market design for system flexibility. That's the barrier number 1. Second, the financial risks. The financial risk, your discoms are already under stress now. Imagine when they have millions of rooftop panels that erode their demand. What will you do? And the second thing, this transition is not just about phasing in new solutions, it's also phasing out existing assets. You have a very important coal fleet. I know that some very important stakeholders in this country allocate to renewables big stranded assets, and when I saw that, this is, what is that? And this is the loss of value of the coal power fleet. Now, will you do this financial risk? How will you avoid that the whole country does not go into an economic recession because of loss of value? If I want to bring the example of Europe, the European utilities left trillions of stakeholder value in the markets in the last decade. So how will you solve that? And then the third barrier, the most important of one, the one that never changes, is policy uncertainty. Now, of course, cost of renewables are getting better, but they still depend on the policies, on the market design. So the next government, let's imagine the next government change, and everything changed. So the next Mexican candidate president is public in saying that he will go back in the energy power reform. How do you deal with that? The policies also have a nice flavor of using the wrong answers to the right question. The right question is, how do you develop local benefits to the community, and then the answer is an import tariff on modules or local content which is mandatory, which are not the right answers. So, and last but not least, in this country, but also in other countries, are you really sure that your central government and the states are aligned? I see the need to have much more alignment in the future, and this is why I also see a nightmare scenario possible.
The only certainty about policy in India is that it is uncertain.
Not just in India.
Vineet, despite your stellar efforts to put a lot of renewable energy capacity on the ground, we also know it's not been an easy ride for you. So why are you still sticking on with it? Or why not?
So should I talk about against the motion, or okay? So I think what worries me is that in India the whole election is now fought on roti, kapda, makan, sadak aur bijli. So the big politics happens around on energy, and unfortunately in India the 220 gigawatt of thermal is owned by large players who are probably very well networked, are very influential. So the biggest risk is that the whole debate can be taken in different direction, and been proven that if coal is not done, the banks will collapse, the public will become bankrupt because their hard-earned money is deposited in the bank, and banks will be in the stress if coal is not continued to be grown. So the same narrative can be differently brought about in the public domain, and from another emotional angle, the drive to invest in coal may continue to increase. And the greatest example is of America, where with the change in leadership, the whole narrative got changed, and suddenly the coal is the most favorite energy source now because it's cost competitive. So that's one of my biggest worries around that. And second is that ongoing challenge that which IEA colleague mentioned about the policy uncertainty. But there is a big stress and big competition, and a lot of people will go out of business because of just our desire to remain in the business. And currently international investors are still keen on this sector because the growth potential it offers, but growth at what cost? People are not investing in this business for charity. They are investing in this business because it makes good economic sense also to invest. So wrong economic decisions, policy uncertainty, change in complete narrative around coal, and I think the final one is around the land, that if India needs 5 gigawatt of solar over next 10 years, then 5 gigawatt solar means 2 crore 50 lakhs odd land. So the land grabbing. So land grabbing will become another big issue, that it's another way of politician giving their friends the most scariest resource we have.
Thank you. The only problem with the debate so far is I'm not getting to ring the bell often enough. They're too disciplined. But Nitin, this should be the easy round for you to debate against the energy transition. So you should have many more points, and I'm going to not ring the bell. Go ahead.
No, thanks. I think where I'd like to start is actually at basics. What does transition mean at the end of the day? I mean, transition implies motion. It means that something actually has to move forward. But as we've been taught in the second law of thermodynamics, there's no such thing as perpetual motion. So it needs a push. Something has to actually push a transition for you to go forward. And let's be clear today. Has even the push happened today? I mean, is there any significance in all the work that has been done over the last couple of years? If you talk about the power systems and a percentage fraction, decimal points and hundredths of decimal points, frankly, are irrelevant, when we talk about this. We've talked about electric vehicles, and frankly, in a world of 1 billion cars and 1.5 billion cars, 50,000 is irrelevant. So let's not talk that the transition has even begun. And has even started to make any motion. In fact, I heard the IEA was telling us just recently that in Europe, emissions has gotten worse, not better. So, and in US, it's gotten better, not worse. So where are we? Yeah, and do we even understand what's driving our transition? I think a push is needed, and where does a push come from? And let's examine that. 3 different areas of where the challenges are. One is policy, and we talked about this. There's been plenty of rhetoric, and there has been some significant policy change, but is it enough? I mean, do we realistically see a pathway today where we can actually integrate the renewables that we want to in the power system that we have? We need separation of carriage and content. We need to see a whole change in the wholesale pricing, the merit order. And all of these are big fundamental changes. Frankly, do we even see states aligned with this to get us there? The second point is we have so much infrastructure built up. I mean, we would have spent $1 trillion just in India itself building infrastructure, legacy infrastructure. And the honest answer is it is always more economical for brownfield expansion or for upgradation than for new capacity. That is always the case. On a marginal basis, that will always be the answer. So what are we going to do with all of these assets that are just sitting there? We have a huge stranded asset problem today. We potentially make the whole thing a lot worse going forward. And the third point is we have a social obligation. Are we realistically going to forget 300 million people who don't have access to energy? I can imagine a conversation that goes along the lines of, Sir ji, pehle bijli de do, phir transition karo na usko. So, I mean, are we really going ahead and making these choices when we have a major development goal ahead of us? And frankly, we have not even brought our entire society and our population to the level where we need them to be. So I do think energy transition is not inevitable. It is possible. And what makes it possible is a lot about the right policy, but also the right levels of collaboration. And I'll probably just end this on a bit more of a positive note to come back and say what it also needs is for all of us to choose to act and to move forward. Otherwise, frankly, if we just sit there waiting and say, you know, here's my transition and let it absorb me, it's never going to happen.
The debate is evenly tied at 15 points each in terms of for and against. Now, this is when we get into the more fun part of the debate. First of all, congratulations to all four of you for surviving thus far. Now you've heard each other. You now have an opportunity to question the other. It could be someone sitting next to you or someone across the stage. Some specific point they've raised, either you agree, disagree. Paolo, you have your hand up, so go ahead.
Okay, it's to Prasad. Just the last words that he said. Very nice words, yes, we all need to act. So I have two questions for you. What is the share of investment in renewables of Shell compared to investment in oil and gas upstream? And second, I'm not mentioning your competitor, but how many years or maybe centuries it will need that you invest at least 20% in renewables so that we pass from blah blah to action?
So let me answer that in a slightly different way. So we have a $25 billion capital commitment on a year-on-year basis, and we've committed 10% of that to new energies. Let me also sort of point out that that's probably one of the largest ever commitments made by any company today, to suggest that over the next 5 years to 10 years, we will spend 25 billion in renewables going forward. It's also worth pointing out that we are already the world's largest player in biofuels. We are one of the world's largest already on offshore wind. And there's plenty of other technology that we've come up and developed along the way. I think I would suggest to you slightly a different way to look at this. On a more serious note, as we talk about capital and capital commitments, I won't be able to show you the percentages, but what I can tell you is of the 25 billion, a lot of it is not associated with new capacity and new oil and gas. And so we should be a little bit careful to come back and make the comparisons, because a significant amount actually is just about keeping the shop running as we stand today. The fields are in decline across the world, and do we really want the lights to turn off tomorrow if everybody stops investing? And I think there's plenty of companies, individuals who raised this issue that investments are declining in oil and gas, and there is a real danger that, of course, as you see the rhetoric over the last couple of weeks, prices will continue to rise. So, is the pace of the change fast enough to offset what could be a $100, $200 world if we're not careful? And so we should be conscious about that. So if I take a look at new capability and new capacity, both in power as well as in fuels, and compare that with new capability and new capacity in oil and gas, I would suggest to you the percentages are already creeping upwards towards 30–40%.
Jen, you have a question for
both Nitin and Frank. Frank, he said that policy uncertainties are going to play a havoc. How do you see the world when the tariffs of renewables would be $2 cents? How do you see the world when you have an iCloud power system, where your phone will become the means of getting your power at home? And mind you, this is also possible because half the Indians use smartphones, and which is also true in villages, and the data lines being there. My personal belief is in 15 years down the line, you will not pay for your power. The power cost will be zero. It will be the data what you will be paying for. So where is the policy required? I don't need a policy at all. Secondly, for Nitin, barring the trumped companies in oil and gas, all the oil and gas companies world over are projecting themselves as renewable companies in solar and wind, but doing also oil and gas. Why are they trying to do that? Is that not the reason of showing that they are transiting? The time period may be longer, but has the transition begun in those companies itself?
Paolo, you want to take that on?
So you have more time. Now, I repeat what I said before. Even if the electricity was for free, you still would have the real issue of system integration and of market design. And I agree with you on your last point. You said in the future probably power will be a commodity and you will not make any money more on that. You will make money on services that you provide. And if you look at the long-term strategy of some European utilities, they're already with this vision in mind. It will take some time. But in this transition, if we don't have the right policy and regulation, we will not go there easily. Because one company will not easily expose itself to competition if the competition is not a level playing field. Even if they are very visionary, they still have to compete in a ground of market rules and policy rules. And this is why I think I'm politically not very correct here, given the fact that politicians not always fully understand the complexity of this. I am always repeating that policy uncertainty remains a major, major issue, even at 2 cents. And even at 2 cents, you will not solve the problem that solar is even here, 2,000, even in the best condition, 2,500 hours per year, and wind 3,000-4,000, maybe even more for wind offshore, but the rest you need to cover with something else.
Yeah, actually I think that's a great answer. I don't have much to add to that other than to also suggest that I think we have a challenge. I think in the end of the day, I'm the first one to suggest that less policy is better than more policy. So let me come back and suggest that I don't think we need to overlay more policy. Maybe policy change is just unwinding the things that we've done in the past. But that in itself is a change. Yeah? And the honest answer is that if you see the impact that Germany or the UK has made, and in one case a good change, and in another case not a good change. I'll let you figure out which one is which. But suffice it to say that in both cases, it was policy and that actually shifted tremendously the behavioral aspect of what we're actually going to come and take forward. So I do think that there is a need to do something there. In answering your question, I think we've been in transition for the last 2 or 3 decades. I'm being very honest about this. Like I said, we were in renewables before, some people, before most of Arunabha's company was born, right? 30 years ago, we were in solar and in wind energy, and as I mentioned to you today, we are the largest in terms of electrical charging of electric vehicles in Europe. We're one of the largest in wind, we're the largest player in biofuels today. So we've been in transition for a long time, and we're quite openly have come back and suggest that it is really important for us to see our verticals and see a power and electricity vertical as being one of the things that we need to see going forward. But we don't see a 100% electricity world, and because there's so many parts of our sectors today that frankly are very difficult to change. I mean, even if you take a look at electric vehicles as a case in point, heavy duty vehicles and transportation of goods is something that we do not have an answer for today to electrify this. It needs solutions, it needs cleaner solutions, but it may not be electrified. So I think the right answer and the right focus needs to be about emissions and carbon. And we need to go back to ground zero and suggest that what we need is sustainable alternatives across our entire application space, whether it's mobility or power or anything else that's there. And to start to look for what is the net emissions impact that we actually are going to create. And that's where our focus is. And we've gone out there and said that by 2030, 2040, we will reduce our operations, carbon in our operations by 50%, not just in our operations, but also in all the products that we sell to consumers. To say what that means that we would have to have a biofuels business globally that would need to grow at about 50 times. We would need to have nature-based offsets, afforestation, that would mean a forest cover the size of Spain to be put in place. We would need to be looking at a Shell itself having 50 to 60 gigawatts worth of renewable power. And then as Shell, just 2% player in the global market, we would have offset 50% of our carbon emissions going forward. So there's a lot more work to be done across the entire landscape.
I have a question for all four of you. All of you raised the issue of policy uncertainty. Why have none of you raised the issue of the cost of finance?
There is always enough finance available for good business. So if there is no policy uncertainty, I will have people queuing up at my door to invest. So when I meet investor, their biggest challenge is that would government buy power from you? They will not cut you down. Will they pay for your power in timely fashion? Will they provide you transmission after you have set up your power plant? So these are the kind of concerns. See, actually the concern is not around investing. I think they evaluate your capability, they evaluate your ability to deliver in timely fashion and ability to raise finance, but their biggest concern is on political uncertainty, and it actually provides annuity business. So there are not many businesses where you can forecast 25-year cash flow. And with the reducing interest rates across the world, money is not a problem. The problem is policy, the problem is the country risk, problem is the currency risk. These are the issues.
I agree what Vineet is saying. If you look at it, Japan, which has got one of the lowest interest rates, or maybe negative for some of the depositors, but if you actually see, the cost of power is the most expensive there. So I believe the cost of finance is only one angle what you're talking about. India having one of the highest cost of finance is having one of the lowest tariffs in the world. So, it's a dichotomy if you look at it, and which is also true. And now then you have a country like US, which is somewhere between, Europe and Japan, and having a cost of power which is probably one of the lowest also today. It is cost of finance will drive itself on its own way as the water flows, and it will depend on country to country. I think so. What Vineet said is the availability of the money is more important, and that's probably enough. There's so much of liquidity in the market that if you are able to give a right package, I think so the money is there on the table.
Concur?
I totally concur. If you have the right regulatory and market framework, financing will flow. And you can observe this already now. You see how financing is going from one country to another on the relative risk profile and risk benefit business. So if something gets stuck because of policy in one country, these flows goes in the other side. And I would like to complement what I said before. I would like not to do the message that good policies are impossible. Of course they're possible. And the real main focus should be around developing the right market design fit for the 21st century. Open to technology innovation, you are right on the iPhones, open to software much more than just hardware, that's the real deal. You then tell me if I can challenge him a little bit more.
Let Nitin answer my question and then we'll
I don't think I have much to add. I think Vineet answered very well. I think in the end of the day, there's no challenge in availability of financing. There's no challenge in terms of the notional rates that's available globally. There are two challenges that I see. One is simply the risk overlay that people have on the infrastructure or the capacity or whatever we choose to build. And the risk overlay gets translated in country risk, sovereign risk, PPA risk, etc. And by the time you add it all up, you come back and suggest that, well, there's no way for us to actually borrow externally. I mean, we did the math ourselves recently on our sort of 20,000 crores that we were bringing in on debt structures, and you look at it and you say, by the time you do 4.5% of currency and 4% of sovereign and 2% of the project risk, you come back and you say, I might as well just borrowed rupees to begin with. Yeah. And so, interestingly, what we should also consider is rupee debt that expensive to begin with, if that's the translation that actually happens, right? So that may be a more broader question to consider. Okay. I would suggest, sorry, just to finish the point off, though, having said all that, I do think that we as a country have limited our ability to actually access the most sophisticated forms of instruments that are actually available. Let's be clear, I mean, masala bonds was great, now they're shut down, right? And as we take a look at most sophisticated markets, you need to have a debt market available. We have a great equity market, but we have such a nascent debt market that it's also inconsequential at the end of the day. So we need to also see some quite serious reforms. Now we know why it came from in the late 90s and not early 90s, sorry, with and all the restrictions that came then. But I think there's a very good challenge on the table saying, does that still apply to us when we have 400 billion in reserves?
You had a point of information to raise with Nitin.
Of course, because he said, oh, let's go back to climate change and carbon. Once again, very nice stories. But now I would like to know your position, or Shell position, on having a carbon price. And with a carbon price, I mean a robust one, not a fake carbon price like the European ETS, including on transport and on carbon footprint of plastics.
I should point out that this is our friends, so you can imagine the conversation when we speak to people who don't like us so much. But having said that, I think we have been very, very clear that we want to see carbon taxation. We want to see carbon pricing. We think it's absolutely critical for us to get there. We have been leading the way, not just in policy development on what a carbon pricing framework and our market exchange can look like, but we today have trading desks that exist that actually trade carbon. And we are very active in the Europe and in North America actually taking a look at this. I think that we are significantly going to fail if we don't come back and start to actually put economic costs on the table of some of the unintended consequences of some of the things that we're talking about. I think it's absolutely true that there are health issues and there are air quality issues and there's CO2 problems, and yet we're willing to sort of live with them because it doesn't sort of come and hit us in the wallet end of the day. I can tell you very clearly, and again I won't tell you the exact number, but any project today in the Shell system, any and every single project in the Shell system has a carbon price built into it. A shadow price that is built into it. We will not take investment decisions without putting a carbon price in there, so because we firmly believe that we will only invest in projects and take things forward if they are sustainable in a world where a carbon price exists. And you will have seen some of the portfolio decisions that we've made over the last couple of years have been very squarely taking a look at where we think the emissions and the carbon price is far too high. And we have walked away from some of those things. So we're making changes. Suman is in there in the audience as chief economist, and he can tell you a lot more about our carbon pricing theories than I can from an economics point of view.
Well, we've had 15 minutes of the speakers debating against each other or agreeing with each other and disagreeing with me. Now we open up the floor for another 15 minutes of questions from the floor. Keep it efficient, like the speakers have. Ask a question and to a specific debater. And there are microphones all around. If you raise your question, yes. Sachin, in front, and then, sir.
I'm Dr. Sharma. When we planned for solar mission way back in August 2009 for 20,000 megawatt by 2020 with a budgetary investment of 90,000 crores, everybody of us thought in planning commission that we are making an impossible plan. But yes, we thought that let's plan it.
Yeah.
And today, we have 20,000 megawatt capacity by 2018. We never got 19,000 crores, but we got 20,000 megawatt capacity. But frankly, I just want to know that on the global investment side, we have a total energy investment of about 1.7 trillion. The RE investment is remaining static at around $300 billion for last 5 years. And the oil and gas investment also remains in a range of about $800 to $1 trillion. When the transition would happen from oil investment to renewable energy investment, because it's a difference of $300 billion versus $1 trillion.
Sure.
But what's more important is that how do we really transit our mindset
Sure.
for investing into RE?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Sharma.
Thank you.
Paolo, I think that's a question for you. Well, no, I think Nitin has held his own quite well thus far, if I may just say. So over to you. You know, when you speak the big words about transition,
okay.
please explain why the money is still not shifting.
Again, it's more a question to him than to me. But anyway, first a comment on the solar mission. First on the solar mission, because I think nobody of us could predict what the Chinese would do. I mean, the solar revolution, let's be frank, was driven by decision taken in China, not necessarily on economic optimization metrics, but it's there. It started with Europe, but then it's the Chinese that have done the job, and now solar is one of the cheapest options in the world. This is just as a comment. Your figures on investment are absolutely right. One other comment, with the same 300 billion today, you install much more capacity than 5 years ago. Massively more. Now, the reason why it doesn't move too much, I think it's more a question to them, but I would say it's because of the non-capability of everybody of us to introduce a carbon price and to really introduce the principle that who pollutes in the end pay, or they transition more quicker. His argument on the fact that a lot of these investments are just for keeping the world the running and not just the new capacities is also true. And I would have a third one. We need also not to invest more in renewables, but also in energy efficiency. And actually, that is the one that worries me much more than the lack of increase of investment in renewables, is the lack on energy efficiency that I'm much more worried about.
Suman, you had a question.
Yes, it actually follows, Suman, it follows on some of this discussion. My understanding of what Jain Saab and Mr. Mittal had to say was that this was being driven, frankly, by economics, perhaps a little bit by concerns about pollution, but not particularly by concerns about carbon footprints and emissions. Did I understand them right for the Indian context? And if I could be permitted an observation, I'm old enough to remember all the excitement around nuclear energy in the 50s and the 60s, and essentially what Mr. Jain was saying about virtually free power. We know to some extent where that movie ended, and my submission would be that India at least would be better off with a diversified energy mix, and therefore supporting, in a sense, what Nitin has said, not just because I worked once at Shell, but because of risk management.
Not the first time we've seen this story play out.
Yeah.
So in kind of Bollywood terms, is there a happy ending always, or is there?
So what you have understood is very clear. I believe it's not only in India, it's world over today. The renewable story is being played out because it is making economic sense, is the cheapest source, and people don't care now whether it is reducing the carbon footprint or not. That is coming as incidental, and you can pat yourself on the back that, look, I did a lot for the society. But the fact is, it's all economics, economics, and economics. That's one part of the story, and that will continue as we move forward. Because the kind of investment what is required for solar and wind, let me tell you this, the equity requirement used to be something around, if I'm not wrong, $1 million per megawatt, not very long ago, is down to even, what, $300,000? Even less than 300, it's $250,000 per megawatt. Now you compare to that investment what is going on in oil and gas sector, I don't think so that investment has gone down. Probably it's more and more going up because you're drilling deeper, you're going in difficult areas, trying to explore in more difficult areas. So it's all economics. I do agree, and I had made a comment earlier also, that distributed power is the need of the hour, especially for a country like India, because now we need electrons and not electrification. In India, the definition of electrification and electricity is different, and that's why I say that. And going forward, you know, the UN sponsored that CERs we used to have, it died its natural death. Even after the death of CERs, the renewables have grown many folds over. So I don't know what carbon footprint, carbon pricing we are talking about. That is all to convince your board members, look, let's make it, because I have to make investment in oil and gas. So look, here is a bucket where I'm trying to cover the carbon footprint. It's only to that, and you want to pat yourself back that I'm trying to save the environment also while I'm putting money in oil and gas. Otherwise, I don't believe that they're actually concerned on the carbon pricing part. Is get your projects through. That's what my view is.
If there were a carbon price, if you could add it to your top line, would it help?
It would definitely help, and I think there is still a marketplace for carbon, because whether we accept it or not, planes are going to be run by the fuels, cars in near foreseeable future will continue to be run by oil. So they might as well pay for the forestation need of the country. Like we have 15% of India's land mass is degraded forest. If that all money can be used, the carbon pricing, and if you can give that money into the pool, not like a Campa fund, which is in Supreme Court monitored account, and not a single tree is planted in the last 10 years. Whereas a small fry like me, we planted in 10 acres more than 30,000 trees. So there is a real need, I think, for causing ecological balance, that the industry which are unavoidable, they should provision something for equitable growth and green growth, and carbon CDM mechanism is the best one.
Polluter pays, but in India's context, not just the carbon price, but the carbon revenue, and if that just goes to say compensate for GST, then it doesn't
That's what
help.
was about to come, you know.
So you have a question there. We'll take two final questions and come back. Paolo, we'll just take the two questions and then come back to you.
Hi, this is Neeraj Menon. My question is that, we often hear that, renewables has reached grid parity, it's going to be cheaper than coal and gas and all of that. But there is this another school of thought that actually questions that price. And the question is that if you were to remove all the concessional financing, if you were to remove all the sort of incentives and subsidies and tax breaks and all of that, including now interstate transmission charge waiver, and even within states, some states have no transmission charge waivers. If you were to put all of that back, then is renewable still at grid parity? And is it a fair competition?
Who would you want that?
Well, let's do the panel and anyone
Okay,
could
we'll,
answer.
we'll let
So
Vineet
actually,
answer.
I think you remember my first point. The heaviest subsidized industry in India is the coal, and no one actually points about it because it's like we have accepted it as a norm, and it actually causes the power sector is causing 30% of our country's pollution, and solar today has no subsidy. We pay 5% GST. Still, the thermal equipment can be brought without any GST. So that's point number one. In the coal transportation, there is a subsidy. In solar transportation, there is no subsidy. And there is no income tax rebate. Accelerated depreciation, you get 40%, which is common for even if I was setting an oil refinery or a thermal power plant. So there is no differential treatment given. I think the only good thing about solar is because our Prime Minister is passionate about it. He is encouraging everyone to not kill the sector. Otherwise, probably like US, now it is so competitive that almost there is this whole story getting planted everywhere that solar and wind is subsidized. And there is no subsidy, not now. Actually, the last subsidy was given is in 2016 bid, where there was 30 to 40 lakh viability gap funding. And now it's taxed at par with any other industry.
Okay. So one
To
question
be
from
very
you.
honest, the kind of money government agencies are collecting on tenders from solar and wind itself could, create something around 5 gigawatts over next 10 years, free of cost. So that's the kind of subsidization we are doing to the government. And coming to, there's no cheap finance for renewables anywhere in the world today. So, but there's a study done in US by Siemens, and they said that if thermal was to be fairly priced and they were to pay for the sins of the carbon, the price would go up by 1 euro cents in Europe.
Question
Yeah.
to you. Question from
My
you.
name is Pankaj Sindhwani from Tata Cleantech. We were talking about the energy transition. My question was, how long do you think it'll take for this transition to happen? And if it is going to take reasonably long time, say 20 years, 30 years, what happens in the intermediate period? We are all, selling power to discoms. Look at their financial health. I mean, if we are going to sell 100 gigawatt of power to the same discoms, I guess we probably didn't talk about this challenge. How does the panel think we'll be able to deal with this challenge till such time that this transition happens? It is probably a possibility that we may not have discoms 30 years down the line. Till such time, what happens?
Let me first turn to Paolo on this question in terms of, even globally, how long would it take? I mean, in the long run, we're all dead. So
I would say at least until 2050 that at least a big investment cycle is needed. Now, on your question on the discoms, I have two approaches here. On one hand, I myself said you have to be careful and not creating too many stranded assets. But then you could also reason from the extreme side that actually in any transition, the rules are done by the winners and not by the losers. When there was the transition from horses to cars, people were concerned about the destiny of the horses, but then this was very, very soon forgotten. So you could play in a combination of the two. And I would suggest, and this then comes to the other question, if I may, about the grid parity.
Yeah.
The grid parity is a misleading concept because you have to ask yourself about against what metrics. So if the market rules are wrong, because they are the old market rules for the 90s and we don't have the right market rules for the 23rd century, speaking about grid parity has no sense. This is the real challenge, to have the level playing field, to integrate the externalities, to really have a real competitive playground where all technologies can compete, and then you can also open to innovation. And my last point where I really wanted to say, I totally agree on the portfolio approach. That's a real clear message from the IEA. As much as I love solar, solar alone will not do the job. We will need a portfolio of technologies, and not just on electricity. I totally concur on the fact that we cannot easily imagine a 100% electricity world. Heat is 50% of total final consumption. Of course, there you can have direct heat. You could combine heat pumps with PV. We spoke before about using thermal storage instead of electric batteries, which cost 10 to 30 times less, and which is an option. And then transport. We are very keen on introducing more and more advanced biofuels for having solutions for aviation, for long-haul transport, where other options, maybe one day hydrogen, but for other options. So in one nutshell, we absolutely need a portfolio of technology and not just focus just on one or two.
Nitin? Yes.
I think it's a really good question, but I think we should first turn around and ask ourselves a different question and say, what's the objective? Transition is a process. It's a journey. In the end of the day, you only know when the journey is complete, when you're actually clear on what the target ever was, right? And so what is the target? Is the target 100% electrification of all industries and sectors? Frankly, today, nobody in the world has an ability to see a pathway there. Let's be clear. I mean, with cement or coal or steel, there is no way to electrify these sectors today. Aviation was sort of mentioned. These are concerns. I mean, and there is a lot of work being done by a number of people to start to say, how do we start to take these hard to abate sectors and transition them to something different? So I think we can't have a conversation about a journey ending until we're clear as to what do we want to achieve, and when we can have a conversation about what we want to achieve, we can then talk about this.
Sure.
Now, we published, if you may give me one second, Nara. Now, Shell's famous for its scenarios, and so we spent an extremely high amount of time thinking about this. And we just recently published a scenario that talked about what does a net zero world in an emissions look like by 2100. So we defined a target, and then overlaid that with what does it take for us to achieve Paris, all right, and 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And you read the book, and it comes back and says it's not a scenario because it's not necessarily an outcome that we believe is even possible today, because frankly, not enough work is going in to try and address some of the underlying issues. So you go back, and there is a real risk that if you say the definition of transition is Paris, we will not meet Paris, and we just have to be very honest and blunt about that. We need even more work and even more technology and more things to be done over the next couple of years. I'd highly suggest, if you want to take a look at that scenario, it at least articulates what does it take.
Vineet and Mr. Jain, could you answer the same question about how long it will take, but from the perspective of the disruption that the discoms are going to face, etc. How do we, get serious? There is going to be a disruption in the political economy, and that has to be managed. It can't be wished away.
My view is that when we as a investor look at discom risk, eventually we convince that we are taking a sovereign risk, and we are working with the utilities, which eventually is owned by government, and government is going to honor the commitment. Like on 100 rupees note, it's written that the RBI governor promises to give you so and so. So our view is, like, we have worked in utilities like Tamil Nadu, which are notorious of delaying your payment up to 6 to 7 months. And eventually they pay. They make the pattern of paying you after every 6 months. But except Ratnagiri project, there is not a single case in India where there is a default. I think in next few years, the sense will prevail on the ruling government, and either they will privatize the distribution fully, right, and not tinker it like politics and their desire to get voters using that. And it has happened in actually the communist state of West Bengal, where I was born and brought up, and after the CSC came in, there was hardly any power outage. You pay your bill on time, and electricity prices were fairly priced, and farmer still pays for the electricity. And I do see that eventually happening. It would not continue that UP sends bills only to 80% of the customer. Right. So actually there is lots of those challenges. There are a lot of low-hanging fruit. I think one of the low-hanging fruit is to make national billing agency and bill everyone as per actual, or prepaid meter, that itself will improve the health significantly. Like restructuring has just done, like Mahajenko now talks about and Mahavitran that we make money. So we could have never imagined someone like Mahavitran, which is Maharashtra utility, making money, though it's 100 200 crore, but it's still like Maharashtra making money is a rare treat, and which is just because of one of the loan being transferred from the utility directly to the government.
Sure.
So I think there are a lot of low-hanging fruit, and I'm sure in a decade, DISCOM related issues will be largely addressed. I'm optimist. That's why I invest in solar.
Sure. The future is not as bleak as it's made out to be. Mr. Jain?
So
Very quick.
answering your first question, you said how long it will take to transit. I think the transition is, we have to look at it from a reference point as to if today we are at 100 on a particular type of mix, what will be that mix look like after 40 years or 30 years or 20 years? I am more optimistic than he said 2050. I believe we are undermining the capability of the Chinese. We are undermining our own capabilities. My belief is by 2035, you could have seen the entire mix changing quite dramatically. It does not necessarily mean wind and solar. It would see a huge mix of new technologies which are carbon neutral. And you might be pleasantly surprised at the advent of the new technologies that nobody even ever thought of. So I believe the work which is going on all over the world will do it much faster than what we think. So if you're thinking of investing in any thermal plant for next 25 years, I would say hold on. Coming back to the health of the DISCOMs. You see, I fully agree with what Vineet is saying. And this is why I'm saying that we should be positive, because the question has been asked by a lender. I can never be negative to So, but one thing you must look at the history of the Indian DISCOMs. There is a different language or understanding in India. In India, the DISCOMs they only default in the payment. They will never say that they will never pay you. It's only a timeline what happens. Yeah. I believe that DISCOMs will definitely improve in 10 years, and the timelines will improve in next 5 years. So if today you're getting paid after 6 months or 5 months, that period will come down to 90 days. That's for sure to happen.
Sure.
And probably privatization of DISCOMs and the way we have been trying to unbundle carriage and content, that is bound to happen.
Okay.
And once that happens, I think so the health of DISCOMs will change dramatically.
Okay, so the lesson is always tell the lender all will be well. Yeah. So we really have to close, and I know there will be a lot more discussions over drinks and dinner. But before closing, I'm going to do one rapid fire round, and you're all allowed to only answer in yes or no. And it's going to be simply one question each. And I'll sort of go in reverse order of the speakers. So, Vineet, do you think India will meet its 175 gigawatt target of 2022 by 2022? Yes. Okay. Nitin, do you think India is locking itself into a solar photovoltaic trap?
Yes.
Paolo, do you think India's electricity-focused renewable energy targets are adequate to drive its energy transition?
Yes.
Mr. Jain, tough one. Do you think trade regulation on panel imports will result in India becoming a manufacturing powerhouse for solar PV?
No.
Okay. The final judgment rests with you. So we'll do it in classic parliamentary style with ayes and noes. The proposition was this House believes that India's energy transition is inevitable. Ayes, please say aye. Okay, either you're hungry or you're really not convinced. Noes? So do I conclude that this is a hung parliament? Because I don't even think we got a quorum of votes. Should we run the vote once again? Ayes? Noes? The ayes have it. Thank you very much.